The issues affecting you. Revealed, explained, discussed. Now on WGAL 8 in Focus.
Hello, I'm Susan Shapiro. Many people trace their family roots, but for African Americans, that journey can be a challenge, especially if they're dealing with U.S. Census records prior to the Civil War. Tonight, we'll talk with 4 people who have researched their family histories, what they've discovered, and the obstacles they faced. We're putting African American genealogy in focus. Joining us now is Neicy DeShields-Moulton. She has researched her family history and has learned quite a bit. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What prompted you to look into your family history?
Being of African American descent, we really don't know who we are. And I have a large family from Southern York County, and I'm sitting there looking at my family and as a young person, and I'm like, who am I? Who are my relatives? I talked to my grandmother, and she never even talked about anything. So I was curious to find out who I was. Who am I connected to? You know, and that's what got me started.
Why do you think your grandmother and others didn't want to talk about that?
I'm only 3rd generation from slavery, and I found a lot of my ancestors did not want to speak about slavery because it was kind of painful to speak about. So they never really talked about anything. They never shared that part of themselves. I just knew her as grandmother. I didn't even know who her mother was, as an example. And that's what made me curious. Like, who's your mom?
You can certainly understand not wanting to talk about it.
Yeah.
So where did you begin your search?
I began my search in York County. I belong to the Green and DeShields family, and I started with both sides of the family. And I did start doing my research then to find out, you know, who am I connected to down, it's actually, I call it down in the country. Because we were down in Muddy Creek and Delta, Peach Bottom, all of that.
Southern York County.
Southern York County. And I started there and then worked my way up. And then I started doing my mom's father's side, and he was originally from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And then I started doing that side, and that just turned into this big umbrella of information.
Now, when you say you started doing that, did you go to the library? Where did you find this information?
First, I started by asking questions, family members, as much as I could. And when I wasn't getting anything there, I just started doing just regular research, just going to the library, going to the archives. And back then, you mainly had to go to the archives. There wasn't much online, but Ancestry was around, so I do census reports. And then as time went on, I started looking at probate records, deeds, and all of those things in order to bring everything together.
A lot of documents.
A lot of documents.
It's much more difficult, as you sort of touched on, for African Americans, isn't
Absolutely,
it, than
yes.
for others? Why is that?
It's because they saw us as property. We were considered chattel slaves, enslavement. And because of that, we were a number on a page, or it was a first name, or they would describe you as to what color you were, what kind of hair you had, or if you had a broken leg, and that's what I would find on those documents. They would say broken leg Charlie or yellow Bob as an example.
So not even a full name on some of those
Not even a full
documents.
name, no. And most of our last names come from European last names or the slave owner.
So that made your search that much more difficult.
Absolutely. My first roadblock was actually my grandfather's, actually my last name, because I found that my last name was spelled D-A-S-H-I-E-L-L instead of D-E-S-H-I-E-L-D-S. And that was my first brick wall. And then once I got over that hump, and then I was able to find all this additional information. I did not know that the last name was spelled different.
How does that happen? Just someone might have misprinted it somewhere along the line?
It could have been that, depends on who wrote it down, because back in those days, we didn't really write things down with somebody else that we would speak to. And it got changed several times. It was DeShields, DeShields.
Wow, sounds like all different family members. So what, if anything, surprised you that you found out?
I found out, especially with that side of the family in particular, they were from the Eastern Shore, and right after slavery, I found that they became oystermen and owned their own oyster lots. And from that, they were able to purchase property and have a whole life. And they actually had, in their small town, they had people there that had barber shops, they had beauty salons, they had corner stores, and they were able to do that right out of slavery. which was amazing to me. And I did find his manumission from slavery, as a matter of fact. So I do have a copy of that where he was free to go into the Civil War.
What does that make you feel like when you see something like that?
When I first saw the document, I had tears, because it's the first time I actually saw real on paper enslavement, that this was real, this is not a joke. And it just sat with me for a while, and I brought up some tears, but I got through it.
All right, well, we're going to get through this, and we're going to talk more about how to do this kind of research and what your advice would be to other people.
This is WGAL 8 in Focus, coverage you can count on.
Rebecca Anstein is now joining the conversation. She's a genealogy researcher who's been talking about researching Civil War veterans. Thanks so much for joining the conversation. You say Neicy got you into this, right?
Yes.
How'd that happen?
We met at a baby shower for her, for family. We're related by marriage, and she talked about doing her family tree. And she said she'd like to prove that her one great-great-grandfather had been a Civil War veteran. So I had some connections that were going down to the National Archives, and I tagged along and started researching veterans. We found her grandfather's pension record, his manumission document, and we were able to trace the grandfather all the way back through several owners that he had.
Wow.
And it also connected with her York County ancestors. And there was a librarian at the York History Center who was putting together a database on Civil War soldiers that were African Americans from York County. So I just added them to my trips down there because it's interesting to do, to find out the stories, the backgrounds, where they were, what happened to them. And just what an amazing group of men they were, because they had to walk all the way to Massachusetts to enlist in regiments up there. They would write letters home. One veteran in particular wrote about how he walked from Lower Chancery Township all the way up to Lancaster on foot to get to the enlistment office, and he was with a friend. They were cold, they were wet, they were tired, they were hungry. They bought a horse that they took turns riding just so they could get to Lancaster to enlist.
Amazing that African Americans were so eager to enlist.
Absolutely.
And that they were not recognized in this country as full citizens.
And actually, Pennsylvania finally, I think it was 2013, acknowledged the Civil War vets for the very first time. They actually acknowledged them in 2013, and they gave me a certificate of appreciation for them serving, since they were never officially acknowledged, the African American or USCT troops. Yeah.
What's that like to have that come on after all those many years?
Actually, it was, I'll just say wonderful. I mean, the work was worth it. To know that they're finally being recognized, because African Americans in so many cases aren't recognized for just about anything they did back in those days. So it felt really good. And thanks to Becky, like she said, I was always using her to pick up the records that I really actually needed.
How hard is that, Becky, to go to the archives and find what you're looking for?
You can do some of that online now through Fold 3 and Ancestry. You can pick up your service records, and you can also check to see if there are pension records. In some cases, you can actually find online the widow's pensions if they had applied, but that's a slow process getting them online. So when you go down to the archives, you want to be prepared to spend the day and make it worth your while.
For sure.
So I'll have a list of about 20 people, hoping that I get at least half of those pensions, because some of them are scattered all over the country in St. Louis, and some of the pensions don't exist. Sometimes you get a couple pages of information, and sometimes you get a pile this thick of documents to go through, and you can make copies of the documents down there and bring them home. So what I did was I would make copies and put families together and then donate all of that to the York History Center.
What do you like about doing this kind of work?
I like researching it. It's interesting because I've learned so much, such as one gentleman who was in York, John Noble. He had enlisted in Connecticut and eventually came to York. And when he died, his widow applied for his pension. And she lived in York, right across the street from where the Vonnie Grimes gym is today. She had houses she rented out. And in this pension, she actually documented how much she was paying in water tax, school tax, how much she was earning through renting out the houses and the secondhand used clothing store that she ran in the front of her house. So you're finding out a lot of information that's family related.
Yes.
And what people were doing to stay alive and earn their living.
Yeah. What was the amount of a pension then?
$8.
Yeah, it wasn't much.
That's what I figured. Well, stay with us. We're going to talk more. We'll talk with a woman who researched a family member who was enslaved.
This is WGAL 8 in Focus. Coverage you can count on.
Joining us now is Celeste Leslie, who researched her 5th times great-grandfather who was enslaved, Caesar Watson. Correct?
Yes, absolutely.
What prompted your research?
Well, you know, I have to give that to my mother. My mother started doing our family history many years ago, when you had to go to the courthouse or you had to go down to the archives to get information. But a few years, well, I would say a few years ago, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, I started to research with her. But I started to do more information online using Ancestry.com. So as I was doing our family tree, I ran across a young lady, and on her death certificate, she had listed her mother and father. And it was after I was able to figure out what the name was, because the writing is never very good. Her father was Caesar Watson, and her mother was Phoebe. And they were from, supposedly, Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. So I started to try to look into them, and I really couldn't find anything at first. But I used another resource that I think is very good, is newspapers.com. So I went in there and I just put in Caesar Watson to see what came up. And I found an 1822 article, or actually it was an advertisement, I'm not sure exactly what they call it, but it was for I believe it said, looking for a runaway. And the runaway's name was Hannah Watson. But as I read on in the article, it actually listed Hannah's parents. And it says Hannah's parents are Caesar and Phoebe, living in Mercersburg. And another good piece of information that was in that article, it said that Caesar's mother, her name was Hannah, and she actually was a slave of Dr. Houston in Columbia.
Wow.
So from there, I just went and tried to find who Caesar and Phoebe were. And I continued to research them.
Is that what happens? You find out one little tidbit and then you
One
go from
piece
there,
takes
kind
you
of
to
like
the
a snowball?
next. Absolutely, and you have to make sure that you've got to try to stay organized. You have to write down everything, because every little piece of information, you would be surprised, are clues. Because one thing that was also a clue in that article, besides Dr. Houston's name, was who the person was that was looking for my, I guess she was my 5th grade aunt, Hannah. And I didn't know at the time that it was going to be an important piece of information. But from that article, I went back to Columbia and was looking at the Dr. Houston and where they could have been. And I found, well, I shouldn't say I found. I was talking to one of my friends. His name is Pete Green, and he was going down in Lancaster history. So he went there and he kind of looked up if he could find anything on Dr. Houston and any people that he may have enslaved. And from there, he actually found an entry. So in 1780, they had the gradual abolition of slavery in Pennsylvania. And the owners were required to go in and register the people that were enslaved at their residence. And we found the entry for Dr. Houston where he actually registered Hannah. She was supposed to be registered as a slave for life, and her son Caesar. And he was registered as a slave for life. So I was able to find him there and started tracing from that point.
Did you feel like you got to know Caesar Watson?
Oh, absolutely. I got to know Caesar Watson because I found him. I was able to find who all his children were through his will. He lists everyone that he had, you know, all his children that were alive at the time. And then I started looking at those children and what they accomplished as they, you know, as they went on. Some of them were Civil War United States colored troops. One of his sons, Alexander Watson, was living in Mercersburg. He was a butcher and became a minister. And of course, me. I'm his fifth grade granddaughter. You know,
Of
I'm here.
course,
So
right.
it just keeps going on and on. So I found out a lot about Caesar.
Yeah. And what impressed you about him?
What impressed me the most, I think, was that he was enslaved. And I seen that I still don't know exactly how he got released because he was supposed to be a slave for life, and it might have been when Dr. Houston died. A lot of times they released their people that they had enslaved. But he made his way to Mercersburg. And again, I couldn't understand why he went to Mercersburg. But I did find that he had a grant for land. And it was around 1819. He went and he applied for land. And the land that he applied for was next to land that was owned by Dr. Houston.
Ah.
And the other person that was the land was by was the person that had put in the article about his daughter being a runaway. So that kind of made me know that that was the correct Caesar that I was looking for. But what I impressed, you know, to answer your question, what impressed me was that he went from being enslaved to being a landowner. He eventually came back to Columbia and purchased a land and a home. He lived in a home. And when he died, he had a will. So most African Americans didn't have wills in around 1848. So he had to have something to give to his family, and he was giving them money. So he had money.
And property.
And
certainly.
property,
A good
actually.
thing to have at any time. Well, thank you so much.
You're
Really
welcome.
interesting what you found out. And coming up on WGAL 8 in Focus, we'll hear from a man who has researched his family history and found his 4 times great-grandfather.
This is WGAL 8 in Focus, coverage you can count on.
Joining us now is Dr. Leroy Hopkins, a retired professor of German at Millersville University, and he has researched his 4th great-grandfather. What prompted you to do that research?
Well, actually, interest, and also because of family history, and then related to my work at the Urban League, when I was trying to find out why young people of color were not getting the educational attainment that they needed to get gainful employment. And thankfully, I had an aunt who passed in 1999, and she told me a lot about the family. And then using the tools, I became a member at the Lancaster History in 1977, and then actually eventually joined the board. I've been on the board since 1983. And that's where I started my research, and that was before Ancestry.com.
Yeah, it's a little easier now.
Yeah,
What
it's
did
a-
you find out about this relative you have been researching?
Well, his name was Cupid, which is not a very nice name. It's a name normally given to the enslaved, but his last name was Paca, but it's sometimes spelled Pico and sometimes Peaker. He himself could not write, but even though he could not write, he owned property. There's a book, An Archaeological History of Harford County, where he's described as a shoemaker, a stonemason, and a land speculator. In 1822,
Those are a lot of skills.
Oh, yes. In 1822, he bought 50 acres of land and paid $700 cash. Not a mortgage, cash. And the question is, where did he get this money? Not that many people wore shoes. And so he was somewhat of he was a property owner, had never been enslaved. He bought his freedom, the freedom of his wife-to-be. Her name was Nancy Prigg. She belonged to Dr. Joseph Prigg, who was a physician in Havre de Grace. And he used his property and his resources to help his community. His children started 2 churches and 2 schools.
Why do you think it's important to do this kind of research and to preserve this kind of history?
I think, you know, we tend to live in a vacuum. We think that the world begins and ends in our lifetime. But if we live like that, there's no future. And so we need to find out where we came from so that we could prepare for where we're going, or where our society is going. And so that's why I do it.
Wow. And I guess as we've talked with the other guests, once you kind of get on to one thing, it leads you to others.
It's addictive. Doing research like this is addictive. You find one little piece and you say, oh, wait a minute, there's another piece and there's another piece.
Any recommendations to folks out there who might be thinking, oh, I'd like to research my family?
Oh, sure. It's easy to do. You just need to go to your public library, look at the census, or even better, talk to your family, talk to your elders, and find out what they went through. And then through that, you can go back to the next generation and the generation after that. And you have to have patience. It's frustrating, but when you find something, it's worth all the hassle.
Feels like you won the prize there, right?
Yes, definitely.
But as we've heard, it's not so easy sometimes with African Americans
Sure.
in terms of the documentation.
Sure. It can be difficult, but more and more records are being made available. Lancaster History, for example, has digitized their collection dealing with African Americans, and it's quite extensive. And then there are other sources, the state archives and the National Archives. Those are places you can go. But you have to have patience, and that's not everyone's cup of tea.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We're glad it's your cup of tea, and we appreciate you having a drink with us. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us for WGAL 8 in Focus. For all of us at WGAL, I'm Susan Shapiro, and join us again next Saturday night at 7 o'clock for WGAL 8 in Focus, right after NBC Nightly News. And you can watch each episode of In Focus, plus WGAL's latest newscasts, original programming, and more. Just download the Very Local app and stream for free on Roku and Amazon Fire TV.